Imagine this for a second. A rain-soaked firing range in Georgia. A line of elite special forces candidates, young, loud, convinced they're the sharpest shooters in the country. And then there's her, sitting alone on a splintered wooden bench, quiet, invisible, dressed like she took a wrong turn on the way to a hardware store. One of them laughs. "Hey, ma'am. You waiting for your husband to finish qualifying?" The others chuckle. They don't lower their voices. They don't need to. To them, she's nobody. Anything. No. What they don't know, what they couldn't possibly know, is that the woman they're mocking is the most dangerous person on the range. A sniper whose records were written in blood and mountain wind. A woman forged in Afghanistan, where mistakes don't get laughed off, they get buried. The rain clings to the air. Wet pine, burnt powder, the sharp bite of gun oil. She doesn't react, doesn't argue, doesn't even look up. She just adjusts her watch and checks her pulse. Because in a world full of noise, the quiet ones aren't weak. They're lethal. And by the end of this day, every man on that range is going to learn that lesson the hard way. Fictional stories, real courage. Subscribe to Hidden Sniper Stories and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Staff Sergeant Sarah Sad Kinsley was 34 years old. Though if you looked at the fine lines around her eyes, the ones that deepened when she squinted into the sun, you'd think she'd live twice that. She sat perfectly still, her calloused thumbs tracing the edge of her jacket pocket. She was supposed to be a guest instructor today, a subject matter expert, as the brass likes to put it. But standing there in her civilian clothes, she looked like a shadow, an afterthought in a world of high-speed gear and tactical egos. The candidates kept looking right through her. To them, she was small, 5'4" maybe. Her hair was pulled back into a tight, practical knot, and her frame didn't scream power. It didn't scream warrior. But they weren't looking at the right things. They weren't looking at the way her eyes never stopped scanning the tree line, or the way she instinctively calculated the lead on a bird flying across the range. Inside, Staff Sergeant Sarah Sad Kinsley felt the familiar weight of it all. Not the weight of her rifle, though that was heavy enough, but the weight of expectation. The weight of being the only one in the room for 15 years. She looked down at her hands. They were steady, rock steady. Her mind drifted back, far away from the Georgia humidity, back to the high, thin air of the Blue Ridge Mountains. She was 9 years old again, standing in the frost-covered grass with her father. He wasn't a military man. He was a hunter, a man of few words and even fewer smiles. She remembered the feel of the old bolt-action rifle. It felt like a cannon in her small hands. She had been shaking, the cold biting through her thin coat. "Sarah," he had whispered, his voice like dry leaves. "The air in your lungs, it's a liar. It moves you. It pushes the barrel. Breath is the enemy of the shot, girl. You find the empty space between the beats and you stay there." That lesson became her gospel. In the Army, through 3 tours in places the map forgets, she had lived in that empty space. She reached up now and adjusted the strap of her watch. It was a habit, but it wasn't about the time. She pressed her fingertip against the radial pulse in her left wrist. Thump, thump, thump. 52 beats per minute. Even with Corporal Reed's insults ringing in the air, even with the rain starting to soak through her collar, her heart stayed in the basement. The candidates were all jacked up on caffeine and adrenaline. You could see it in their twitchy movements, the way they checked their gear 5 times a minute. They were fighting the environment, fighting the rifle, fighting themselves. Staff Sergeant Sarah Sad Kinsley just waited. She knew that long-range shooting isn't about strength. It isn't about who can scream the loudest or run the fastest with a ruck. It's about the soul. It's about becoming a part of the wind, a part of the dirt until you disappear. She looked at Corporal Reed again. He was laughing with his buddies, adjusting his expensive, brand-new optics. He was so sure of himself, so convinced that he was the apex predator on this range. Well, Staff Sergeant Sarah Sad Kinsley had seen men like him before. Men who thought the rifle did the work. They usually learned the hard way that a fancy scope doesn't mean a thing if you can't control the ghost in your own chest. She felt a slight ache in her shoulder. A souvenir from a piece of shrapnel in Cooner. It throbbed in the damp cold, a rhythmic reminder of a night when the world had turned into fire and lead. She didn't mind the pain. It was a grounding wire. It reminded her that she was still here, still breathing, still capable of making the world stop with a single squeeze of a trigger. "You okay there, ma'am?" Another candidate asked, this one a bit older. A sergeant with a kender face. You've been staring at that target for 10 minutes. You know it's over 1,000 yards out, right? Nobody's hitting that today. Not in this crosswind. Staff Sergeant Sarah said. Kinsley turned her head slowly. She didn't smile. She just let her gaze settle on him. A look so flat and clinical it made the sergeant blink. The wind is only a problem if you try to fight it, Sergeant, she said. Her voice was low, controlled, like a stone dropping into a deep well. If you listen, it'll tell you exactly where to aim. The sergeant frowned, confused. He looked at his buddies and shrugged. To them, she was just talking nonsense. Just some civilian lady who'd seen too many movies. They didn't see the caluses on her trigger finger. They didn't see the way she breathed. Shallow, rhythmic, intentional. They just saw a shadow, and shadows are easy to ignore until the lights go out. Staff Sergeant Sarah Sade Kinsley turned her attention back to her rifle case. She wasn't ready to open it yet. Not until the moment was right. She wanted them to stay loud. She wanted them to stay arrogant. Because the fall is always more educational when you're standing on a pedestal you didn't earn. She checked her pulse one last time, 51 beats. The range was almost hot. The history of this place. The thousands of snipers who had passed through these woods felt heavy in the air. But today was going to be different. Today, the boys were going to learn that history doesn't always look like a recruitment poster. Sometimes history is quiet. Sometimes it wears a faded jacket and waits patiently on a cold, wet bench, and sometimes history never misses. The range went hot at 0800. The air was thick, like trying to breathe through a wet wool blanket. Master Sergeant Elias Thorne, a man with a face like a topographical map of a bad neighborhood, stepped up to the line. He was a peer of Staff Sergeant Sarah Sade Kinsley's. They crawled through the same Afghan dust 10 years ago. But today, he didn't even look at her. He didn't offer a nod or a hello. He knew the game. He wanted to see how these candidates handled a distraction in their midst. First event is the cold bore. Master Sergeant Elias Thorne barked, his voice cutting through the damp air. One shot, one target at 500. No warm-ups, no excuses. See anything? No. If you can't hit the center of mass with your first breath, you're just a loudmouthed rifleman with an expensive telescope. The candidates scrambled. Corporal Jax Reed, the loud one, was first on the mat. He was focused, sure, but Staff Sergeant Sarah S. Kinsley watched his hands. He was gripping the stock too tight, white-knuckling the grip. He was fighting the Georgia humidity. The wind was a nightmare. It wasn't a steady blow. It was a fishtail wind. It would gust from the left at 10 mph, then drop to a dead calm, then swirl back from the right. It's the kind of wind that makes snipers question their career choices. Crack. Corporal Reed's round went wide right. A clean miss. He swore a sharp, angry sound and started frantically adjusting his turrets. One by one the others followed. Crack, crack, crack. Out of 12 candidates, only 2 even nicked the edge of the steel. The rest were hitting the dirt, sending up small geysers of mud. Staff Sergeant Sarah S. Kinsley sat on her bench, watching the grass. It was leaning slightly to the left at the 300-meter mark, but at the target, the rain was falling straight down. There was a pocket of dead air in the middle. Corporal Reed stood up, his face flushed with frustration. He saw Staff Sergeant Sarah Sade Kinsley watching him, and his ego needed a target. He walked over, wiping mud from his knee. Rough day for a spectator. Huh, he said, his voice tight. He leaned down, placing a hand on the bench next to her. You probably don't get how this works. See, we're dealing with MOA, minute of angle. It's a math problem. At 500 ID, a 1-degree shift in the wind moves the bullet 5 in. It's probably a bit much to grasp if you've never been behind the glass. He was mansplaining the very basics of her life's work. He spoke to her like she was a child, like she was a tourist who had wandered into a laboratory. Staff Sergeant Sarah Sade Kinsley looked up at him. She didn't blink. She didn't correct him. She just watched a bead of rain roll down his forehead. What would you have done in that moment? Would you have corrected him? Would you have pulled out your credentials and put him in his place? Or would you have done what Staff Sergeant Sarah Sade Kinsley did? She just nodded, a slow, rhythmic movement, and said nothing. She let the silence sit between them until it got uncomfortable. She let the target do the talking, and right now that target was clean. You should check your level, she said softly. Corporal Reed blinked. My what? Your bubble level. Staff Sergeant Sarah Sade Kinsley replied, her voice a flat line. You're canning the rifle to the left when you squeeze. It's only a few degrees, but at 500 mem. That's why you're hitting the dirt. Corporal Reed laughed, a harsh, dismissive sound. He turned to his buddies. Hey guys. The lady says, uncanning my rifle. Maybe I should ask her to hold my purse while I go again. The group erupted in a chorus of snickers. It was the boys' club closing its doors. It was a dynamic Staff Sergeant Sarah. Sarah said Kinsley knew by heart the collective exclusion, the silent agreement that she didn't belong in their circle of warriors. She felt the sting, that old familiar heat in the back of her neck, but she didn't let it reach her hands. She checked her pulse. 52. All right, enough grab ass. Master Sergeant Elias Thorne yelled. Move to the woodline. Phase 2 the stalk. The challenge was simple on paper. Move 300 mummler through the brush unnoticed, and kill the instructors sitting in the tower with high-end thermal optics. The candidates began their jilly prep. They were piling on the burlap, the jute, the plastic leaves. They looked like walking haystacks. They were obsessed with the visual, with looking like the snipers they saw in the movies. Staff Sergeant Sarah said Kinsley walked along the edge of the prep area. She saw them spraying themselves with scent blocker, but she noticed something. They were all ignoring. The sun was trying to peek through the clouds. The humidity was rising. You're going to bloom, she said as she passed Corporal Reed. He was busy tying a branch to his shoulder. Excuse me. The burlap, she said, stopping for a second. It's soaked. Your body heat is going to trap under that wet fabric, and you're going to look like a campfire on the thermal scope. You need to vent your suits. Let the air move, or you'll be glowing before you hit the first 100 meters. Corporal Reed didn't even look at her this time. He just spat on the ground. Thanks for the fashion advice, ma'am. We'll stick to the manual. We've been training for this for 6 months. I think we know how to hide. Staff Sergeant Sarah said Kinsley watched them crawl into the woods. It was painful to watch. They were moving too fast, dragging their heavy suits through the mud. Inside the observation tower, Master Sergeant Elias Thorne sat with his thermal binoculars. He didn't have to search. Within 10 minutes, he saw a bright white-hot shape moving through the blue-green background of the forest. Then another 3 more contact. Master Sergeant Elias Thorne radioed. Candidate 3, I see your head. Candidate 12, you look like a goddamn neon sign. Out. All of you out. One by one. The elite candidates walked out of the woods, dripping with sweat, their expensive ghillie suits heavy with mud and failure. They were exhausted. They were humbled, but they were also angry. They looked for someone to blame. They looked at Master Sergeant Elias Thorne. They looked at the weather. And then they looked at Staff Sergeant Sarah City Kinsley. She was still sitting there. Her clothes were dry. Her hair was neat. She looked like she didn't belong in their world of dirt and failure. What are you even doing here? Corporal Reed snapped, his frustration finally boiling over. He walked right up to her, his chest heaving. You come out here, you whisper your tips, you act like you know the struggle, but you haven't moved an inch. You haven't felt the weight. You're just a ghost, a tourist watching us bleed. The group crowded around. It was a wall of camouflage and resentment. Staff Sergeant Sarah said Kinsley felt the space around her shrink. The boys' club had turned into a mob. I've moved my share of inches, Corporal. Staff Sergeant Sarah said Kinsley said her voice didn't rise. It didn't waver. It stayed in that low clinical register. The sound of a surgeon describing a terminal diagnosis.
Oh yeah.
Corporal Reed sneered.
Where?
In a video game, in a book. He reached out, a sudden aggressive movement, and tapped the top of her rifle case. Why don't you show us what's in the box then? Or is it just a lunch tray? See anything? Staff Sergeant Sarah Sadie Kinsley's hand moved. It was a blur, a flash of motion that ended with her fingers wrapped firmly around Corporal Reed's wrist. She didn't twist. She didn't strike. She just held him there. Her grip was like iron. Not the grip of a civilian, but the grip of someone who spent their life holding on to things that wanted to fly away. Corporal Reed froze. He looked down at her hand, then up at her eyes. For the first time, he saw the shadow clearly. He saw the cold, predatory stillness that he had been mocking all morning. The box stays closed until it's time for work, Staff Sergeant Sarah Sade Kinsley said. She released his wrist. And Corporal, your heart rate is at 95. You're shaking. You'll never hit the steel with those hands. She turned her back on them, returning to her bench. The silence that followed wasn't the silence of respect. Not yet. It was the silence of confusion. They didn't know what she was, but for the first time, they were starting to realize that whatever she wasn't a tourist. Master Sergeant Elias Thorne watched from the tower, a small, grim smile touching his lips. He knew the guest instructor was about to stop being a guest. The rain began to pick up again, a steady rhythmic drumming on the roof of the range. The real test was coming, and Staff Sergeant Sarah said Kinsley was just getting started. The rain didn't just pick up, it turned into a horizontal curtain of gray. Master Sergeant Elias Thorne stepped to the edge of the concrete pad, his boots splashing in the growing puddles. He pointed a gloved finger toward a distant jagged gap in the treen, a place the instructors called the throat. "All right," Master Sergeant Elias Thorne bellowed, his voice straining against the wind. "Knee target. 100 m. It's tucked inside that draw. The wind in the canyon is moving twice as fast as the wind on this line. It's a literal meat grinder for bullets." The candidates scrambled to their positions. Corporal Jax Reed was the first to try. He had his Kestrel out, a high-tech weather meter, waving it in the air like a magic wand. He was punching numbers into his ballistic computer, clicking his turrets with frantic mechanical desperation. Crack. The round disappeared into the gray. No splash, no impact, just gone. "Left. 2 mils left," his spotter yelled. Corporal Reed adjusted. "Crack high." The lift got it over the top. One by one, the candidates took their turns. They burned through magazines. They adjusted and readjusted. The air was filled with the smell of burnt powder and the sound of frustration. Out of 12 of the Army's finest candidates, not a single piece of steel rang out. The ego on the range didn't just deflate, it died. They were looking at their rifles like they were broken toys. "It's impossible," Corporal Reed muttered, throwing his empty magazine into the mud. "The wind is shifting every 3 seconds. You can't time a shot like that." "Nobody can." Master Sergeant Elias Thorne didn't look at Corporal Reed. He turned his head slowly, looking toward the back of the range, toward the quiet woman in the faded Carhartt jacket. "Kinsley," Master Sergeant Elias Thorne said. The name was a low rumble. "You want to show these kids why they're still wearing training wheels." The range went silent. Even the rain seemed to quiet down for a second. The candidates looked from Master Sergeant Elias Thorne to Staff Sergeant Sarah Sad Kinsley, their eyes wide with a mix of confusion and growing realization. Staff Sergeant Sarah Sad Kinsley didn't say a word. She didn't boast. She didn't even look at Corporal Reed as she stepped over the dead brass on the ground. She walked to the center of the line. She didn't use a Kestrel. She didn't pull out a computer. She dropped into the prone position. It wasn't the clunky, heavy movement of the candidates. It was liquid. One moment she was standing, the next she was a part of the earth. Her rifle, that old scarred M24, found her shoulder like it was coming home. She didn't look through the scope immediately. She stared at the treen with both eyes open, watching the rhythm of the rain. She was waiting for the lull, the half-second heartbeat where the wind in the canyon and the wind on the line canceled each other out. "Mom," Corporal Reed whispered, his voice cracking. "The hold is at least 4 mils left. You can't." "Quiet, Master Sergeant," Elias Thorne snapped. Staff Sergeant Sarah said Kinsley's finger rested on the trigger. Her breathing wasn't breathing at all. It was a slow, controlled tide. She wasn't fighting the rifle. She was melting into it. She felt the pulse in her wrist. Thump, 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 thump. She waited for the space between. She didn't use the turrets. She used a holdover, an instinctive visual adjustment based on 20 years of seeing the invisible. Crack, the M24 barked. A deep authoritative sound that made the lighter rifles seem like cap guns. Staff Sergeant Sarah said Kinsley didn't move. She didn't lift her head to look. She stayed on the glass, following the trace of the bullet through the air. 3 seconds passed. 4 clang. The sound of the steel hitting came back through the rain. A sharp bell, like tone that cut through the Georgia mist. It wasn't just a hit. It was a T-box strike right between the eyes of the silhouette at over 1,000 meters with a cold bore, and a rifle that belonged in a museum. Staff Sergeant Sarah said Kinsley remained perfectly still for a long moment. She didn't cheer. She didn't pump her fist. She just cycled the bolt, catching the spent smoking brass in her hand before it could hit the mud. The silence that followed was deafening. Corporal Reed looked like he'd seen a ghost. His mouth was open, his face pale. The other candidates were frozen, their eyes start darting between the tiny woman on the mat and the distant impossible target. They had just seen something they didn't think existed. They had seen a master at work, and they realized with a crushing sense of humility that they hadn't just been disrespectful to a civilian. They had been mocking a legend. Staff Sergeant Sarah Sadie Kinsley stood up slowly, brushing the wet sand from her jacket. She looked at Corporal Reed, not with anger, but with a strange kind of pity. "The wind doesn't care about your computer, Corporal," she said, her voice as cold and clear as a mountain stream. "It only cares if you're brave enough to listen to it." She stepped back toward her bench, leaving the elite soldiers standing in the rain, wondering who the hell was sitting in their midst. Master Sergeant Elias Thorne just nodded. A single sharp movement. He knew the lesson had finally begun. The mini twist wasn't just the shot. It was the realization that the most dangerous person on the battlefield rarely looks the part. The rain seemed to lose its sting as a black SUV pulled up to the edge of the range. Out stepped a man who looked like he'd been carved from a block of granite. Command Sergeant Major Silas Vance. He was a legend in the community, a man who'd spent more time in combat zones than most of these candidates had been alive. He walked toward the firing line, his eyes scanning the group. But then he stopped dead. He didn't look at Thorne. He didn't look at the targets. His eyes locked onto Sarah, who was quietly wiping a smudge of oil from her M24. The range went absolutely still. Silas didn't cheer. He didn't shout. He did something that made the hair on the back of Corporal Jack Reed's neck stand up. He reached up and slowly removed his cover. He stood there in the pouring rain, showing a level of difference that a sergeant major usually reserves for the fallen. "Staff Sergeant Kinsley," Silas said. His voice was thick with a respect that felt heavy. "I haven't seen you since the valley since shock." Sarah looked up. She didn't smile, but her eyes softened just a fraction. "Sergeant Major, good to see you still kicking." Silas turned to the stunned candidates. He looked at Jax, who looked like he wanted to vanish into the mud. "I see you boys have been testing our guest," Silas said, his voice dropping into a dangerous low rumble. "Do you have any idea who is sitting on that bench?" This is the woman the insurgents called the Shadow of Shock Valley. She was the first female sniper in the history of this branch to record a confirmed kill at over 1,000 m. And she didn't do it on a range. He paused, letting the words sink in. She did it at night in a blizzard while a ranger platoon was being squeezed in a kill zone. She sat on a ridge for 14 hours without moving, and she held an entire mountain pass by herself. She's the reason those men came home. She's the reason I'm still standing here. The shift in the air was physical. The candidates didn't just stand straighter. They looked like they were trying to snap their own spines into a position of attention. Jax Reed's face went from pale to a deep burning crimson. He didn't look away. He couldn't. The only sound was the rain hitting the metal roof. Tink, tink, tink. The mockery, the jokes, the boys' club. It had all evaporated. In its place was a silence so profound it felt like a prayer. They weren't looking at a civilian anymore. They were looking at the pinnacle of their profession. They were looking at a woman who had broken history, not with a shout, but with a single perfectly timed breath. The silence on the range was heavy. It was the kind of silence that happens after a thunderclap where the air feels thin and the world just stops. Corporal Jax Reed, the one who had been so loud, so sure of himself, didn't join the others in their rigid posture. Instead, he did something better. He stepped forward, his boots squatching in the Georgia mud. He didn't offer a scripted apology. He didn't try to explain away his arrogance. He simply reached into his kit and pulled out his high-end spotter's scope. With both hands and with his head bowed just a fraction, he held it out to her. It was an ancient gesture, a submission. He wasn't just giving her a tool. He was handing over his ego. He was asking, begging for her to lead. Sarah looked at the scope. Then she looked at the boy. She saw the shame in his eyes. But she also saw the hunger, the sudden desperate need to be better than he was 10 minutes ago. She didn't humiliate him. She didn't bring up the fashion advice or the jokes. The glasses tilted. "Corporal," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper against the wind. "If you don't level your tripod, the world will always look crooked." She took the scope, and then for the next 4 hours the guest disappeared. Sarah Kinsley didn't stay on that dry bench. She dropped back into the mud. She crawled through the slush and the pine needles with them. She laid down in the dirt next to each man, her voice a calm, rhythmic pulse in their ears. She taught them the art of the hold. Not the math they found in the U.S. Army Sniper School manual, but the soul of the shot. "Don't pull the trigger," she told Jax, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder as he lined up the 1,000-meter target. "You let the rifle decide when it's ready. You just stay in the empty space." She showed them how to read the mirage dance and how to feel the wind on their skin, instead of reading it on a screen. She taught them that a sniper isn't a person with a gun. A sniper is a ghost that the environment forgot to erase. The transition was absolute. She wasn't the woman on the bench anymore. She was the master of the range. The candidates didn't see her gender, and they didn't see her civilian clothes. They saw a living library of combat wisdom. They saw the shadow of Shock Valley. By the time the sun began to dip behind the pines, the candidates were exhausted. Their OCPs were ruined, caked in layers of red clay. But as they stood in a semicircle around her, their eyes were different. They weren't jacked up on bravado anymore. They were quiet. They were focused. Jax Reed was the last one to get up. He had finally hit the steel 3 times in a row. He looked at Sarah, his face splattered with mud, and he didn't say a word. He just snapped a sharp, crisp salute. It wasn't required for a civilian. It wasn't in the regulations, but it was the most honest thing he had done all day. Sarah didn't salute back. She wasn't active duty anymore. She just gave him a small, tired nod. The kind one veteran gives another when they both know the cost of the ground they're standing on. She had passed the torch. She hadn't just taught them how to hit a target. She had taught them how to be silent. And in the world of the long-range kill, silence is the only thing that keeps you alive. Fictional stories, real courage. These moments are why we do this. Stick around because the final lesson Sarah left behind. It's the one that stays with you forever. The rain finally slowed to a thin rhythmic drizzle. The kind that makes the pine trees look like ghosts in the Georgia mist. Staff Sergeant Sarah said Kinsley didn't stick around for the debrief. She didn't wait for the sergeant major to pull her aside for a formal thank you or a commemorative coin. That wasn't why she came. She walked back to her bench, her movements slow and wary, and began to pack away the M24. She wiped down the bolt one last time, her fingers lingering on the scarred stock. She didn't need a parade. She didn't need her name on a plaque in the National Infantry Museum. She wanted to be remembered by the change in the way those boys held their rifles, by the way they now looked at the wind with a sense of reverence. She wanted her legacy to be the fact that somewhere down the line in a valley far from home, one of those boys would remember to breathe, and he would live. As she snapped the latches on her case, clack, 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 clack. The range felt different. It was quieter. The bravado had been replaced by a heavy professional stillness. Master Sergeant Elias Thorne watched her walk toward her truck, but he didn't call out. He knew you don't thank a shadow for passing through. You just appreciate the coolness it leaves behind. You see, true power doesn't need to bark to be felt. It doesn't need to scream its rank or flash its medals to command a room. Real strength, the kind that shifts the course of history, is usually found in the person who doesn't feel the need to prove a thing. It's found in the quiet ones, the ones who listen while others talk, the ones who have already been through the fire and don't feel the need to describe the heat. Staff Sergeant Sarah Sade Kinsley drove away from the range. Just another civilian in an old truck disappearing into the gray afternoon. But the shadow of Shock Valley stayed behind. She stayed in the minds of 12 young men who would never look at a tourist the same way again. She reminded us all that courage isn't about being the loudest person in the circle. It's about being the one who stays steady when the world is shaking. It's about the discipline to wait for the empty space between the heartbeats and the humility to let your actions be your only witness. In the end, the noise of the world fades away. The insults, the ego, the pride, it all turns to dust. But the truth stays. Sometimes the quietest soldiers carry the loudest legacies. That's it for today. If you felt that, like the video, drop a comment. Where are you watching from right now? Subscribe and hit the bell for more stories of courage, skill, and the warriors who never needed to shout. We'll catch you in the next one.